Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
You are listening to the Gospel Addict Podcast, where we are passionate about the gospel, the good news about Jesus. And we know that the gospel is not just the ABCs of the Christian life, but it's the A to Z of the Christian life. On this episode, I'm joined with two other men, Tom Petersburg and Hollis Haff. Tom is going to assist me as a co-host as together we interview Hollis. Men, while most of our listeners are in the U.S. and Canada, I just want to share with you that in the last 30 days, people have listened from the following countries: the UK, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Croatia, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Botswana, South Africa, Pakistan, India, Australia, and New Zealand. And that's one of the things that gets me excited about this podcast, is just how it has a worldwide reach. I would be thrilled if people listening to this podcast would get involved with what the kind of work that both you men are doing. Tom gives leadership to Catapult Ministries. Catapult Ministries exists to advance discipleship. They desire to see people grow in an awareness that God has not only called us into a relationship with Him, but He has uniquely shaped us, gifted us, and positioned us to serve Him for His glory. If you want to learn more about Tom's ministry, go to catapultministries.org. We're here to talk to Hollis, and thank you, Hollis, for making the time to be on this episode. He graduated from West Virginia University and actually played on the Mountaineers' 15th nationally ranked Peach Bowl championship team. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Hollis, what was your position on the team?
Tight end.
You were a tight end. Okay. You went on from there, and you've been in various ministries. You've served as a pastor. You've been a chaplain for the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Pirates. But currently you work for the Bonhoeffer Project, which is something we want to learn a lot more about. Great to be with both of you guys this evening. Let's begin with you, Tom, because you were the one who connected me with Hollis. Why don't you share with our audience how the two of you know each other and why you thought he would be a good guest for this podcast?
I came out of the campus ministry at Vanderbilt University in 1979. Athletes in Action asked if I would consider being a chaplain to the pro teams in Cleveland. And so they connected me with Hollis. Hollis was already one of the staff guys, one of the chaplains in the NFL. He was one of 5 men who were pioneers as chaplains in the entire NFL and had opened chaplaincy. So I flew into Pittsburgh in 1979 in April or May. And Hollis and I drove to Cleveland, and we met with some of the men with the Cleveland Indians and the visiting team that day. Hollis had also been in touch with the head coach of the Browns, Sam Bertigliano. And so Hollis took the role of kind of introducing me to the Cleveland teams and kind of orienting me to ministry. So it was Hollis who kind of set my feet on the ground and gave me some direction.
Wow, that is so cool. And Hollis, I want to learn about the Bonhoeffer Project, but I'm really interested also in learning about those early days when you were a chaplain. Now, I've got to be honest with you. I was born in Pittsburgh. I would have gone to Montour High School if I would have grew up there, which I'm sure you've heard of that high school. I ended up moving to Akron, Ohio when I was 10 years old. But I'm a diehard Steelers and Pirates fan. So let me just throw out this question right off the top. Did Terry Bradshaw, was he ever involved in your ministry when you were a chaplain?
Yeah, he was actually at the core of it at the very beginning. We had some of our earliest Bible studies at Terry's apartment downtown, and would gather there for Bible studies. He was I got there in 1974, Greg, which was good timing because that was when Terry was benched. He was going through some challenges. And so he connected with me because I was a Christian. I told him what I wanted to do. And so he started immediately introducing me as the chaplain, the new chaplain of the Steelers. Well, once Terry introduces you as the chaplain of the Steelers, it kind of sticks. And you might remember that was the first year they went to the Super Bowl. So the first 4 of 6 years that I was there, the Steelers won a Super Bowl. So they couldn't really accuse me of, messing them up any. And yeah, he was very involved. On Mondays, we would go down and I'd catch passes from him because no one else wanted to go in and loosen them up. So we had a very, very close relationship during those early years.
That is so cool. That is so great to hear, because those were the years when I was a young kid cheering for the Steelers, because those were great days for the Steelers. Like you mentioned, all the Super Bowls they won and such. Are there any other stories, like, as you think back, and you were also a chaplain for the Pirates? Did you do that at the same time?
Yeah, I did. I actually did some work with the Penguins too, although they were a much harder team to crack.
So do you have any other interesting stories just from that, as you look back? And you don't have to mention people's names, but just stories of, how you saw God work, or even maybe mistakes you made as a young chaplain.
Yeah, I made plenty of mistakes. In fact, I often look back now and think that some of what I'm doing now in discipleship, grew out of some of those early mistakes. But I also saw God's hand in it pretty powerfully. When I grew up as a kid, grew up in Ohio, around Sandusky, a little town called Bellevue. There, you could count the Christian athletes in pro football, pro baseball ranks on, probably one hand. There was Raymond Berry and Bill Glass and, a few others. So when we became part of that pioneering movement in 1974, there were just 5 of us, and it was like, it was almost like a missionary operation. But when I look back now, when I watch the Hall of Fame presentation each year, I'm always struck by how many guys get up and give testimony to their faith in Christ. It's normative now for teams to have significant contingents of Christians, and all that changed when we kind of took God at his word. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples. And so even though I had a lot of anxiety as a young 20-year-old kid, trying to walk into a professional franchise, that kind of gave some steel to my backbone to say, no, God's for me here, and he's going to go before me. And, you did see just all kinds of amazing things happen. We established a chapel program early on, and that grew from 3 or 4 guys to 25 within a year. We started having small groups where their wives could come and take part. We even had discipleship groups early on. We began doing outreach programs. We had high school assembly programs, did over 300 high school assemblies in the tri-state area. We did a football camp. And when I look back and think, what did you do right? What did you do wrong? The one thing we did right was we got these pro athletes, as they started to come to Christ, out involved in sharing their faith and taking advantage of the platform that they have as professional athletes. And when I look back now, there's probably a dozen or more guys that I worked with that are, might as well be in ministry. If they're not officially in ministry, that's what they're doing. And I think the reason is because their early experiences were that they found so much satisfaction in being able to be involved in the changing of other people's lives, that they made easier transitions into post-football life. They stuck with their faith over the long haul. So that I think was one of the best things I did. We'll probably get into, maybe some of the things I would have done differently as we get into Bonhoeffer, because that's become a kind of a clarifying experience for me to look back and to see, why is it that the church as a whole is having such a hard time with the core ministry of the church. It's what Jesus said was the core mission of the church, and yet less than 1% of pastors think we're doing a good job with it. So how do you explain that disconnect? And that bothered me, all through my years with Athletes in Action, when Tom and I were working with the same organization. And then as I became a church planner for the next 20 some years, and then just in the last few years, I've, transitioned into the Bonhoeffer Project, where I actually work with pastors and Christian leaders. But I've got that, history behind me to see, what things we did wrong and what things really helped.
That's great. Yeah, I think, and I'm excited to get to this, because I think one of the things that you've identified is how we've separated salvation from discipleship.
Yeah.
And we've made the mistake where we emphasize personal salvation, and then we have kind of, discipleship is just been left out. And Tom, do you have any, can you think of any stories when Hollis was training you? Like, did you go to one of his services when he was a chaplain? Did you observe him?
No, he would have, we probably would have been on the phone from a distance. After my first year there, the outreaches that Hollis talked about in some of the high school campuses, they would take athletes, 3 or 4 athletes into a school, and they would compete against some of the athletes in the school in a number of events in a gymnasium. So they'd have the whole school there. And then the players would share their testimony in between events. But it was the competition that really engaged the students and so on. So one of Hollis's training was to come with me. And so we went down to a little town about an hour and a half from Cleveland called Worcester. And Hollis had one of his players come there. And I had a couple of guys from Cleveland come. And we spent 3 days in the Worcester area. I think we did about 3 schools a day. But at the end of the first day, we didn't do a school. We did a home for troubled boys. And the next morning at breakfast, Hollis said to the player that he brought along with him, one of the active players from the Steelers, "So, how you sleep well last night? How are you doing this morning?" And he said, "Well, not well. I didn't sleep at all." He said, "My family has a farm in Georgia, and God has convicted me that we need to turn that into a boys' home." And he's done that. He has both a boys' home for troubled kids in Pittsburgh and one in Georgia. Even to this day, I've talked with players that when they come in as rookies at the Steelers, they make a visit to those places and see what impact a player has in the community. So a lot of the things that I got from Hollis and from other guys would have been during conferences and during events that we did together. It was a very active time. I think the thing that drove it was something that Hollis said the very day that we met and drove into Cleveland. He said, "The players are the basis of your ministry, not the scope of it." And so the whole point was to build disciple players, equip them to have a ministry, and they were the ones that had the impact in the world. And it's really it's a similar picture in discipleship. And I think that's what's always excited me about discipleship. I love the guys I'm discipling, but they're just the basis of it. Those guys are going to multiply and have another guy and another guy, and it spreads.
Yeah, the fellow that Tom was referring to had to be Mel Blount.
Yes.
And Mel has those 2 boys camps going today, and I think that's a great example of how when you get people out doing ministry and just rubbing shoulders with kids and others that they can have an impact on, it is very impactful. It's very formative, and they just begin to gravitate to ministry because they find great joy in it.
That's cool. One of the things that impresses me about the Steelers in particular is just they just seem like a real family atmosphere, and the way they can keep a coach for so long and they keep a quarterback for so long. Was it that way when you were there?
Yeah, that's when the change was happening, and that's what happens when you become a winning franchise. They both kind of feed each other. But I think the Rooneys, long-term ownership, and they're kind of very down to earth. Pittsburgh kind of family. It certainly fueled that. The fact that they've had, only a handful of coaches in their whole history, fuels that. And the town of Pittsburgh is very much like that. So, it's I think even among insiders in football, players themselves, they would say, "Oh, I would love to play in Pittsburgh because they really take care of their people."
It seems that way. It seems that way. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how did you end up with the Bonhoeffer Project? It seems like you've had a lot of ministry experiences, great ministry experiences, but what was it about the Bonhoeffer Project that drew you in?
Well, I did. I was very fortunate. I had a wonderful experience with Athletes in Action, working with pro athletes. I had, wonderful success in many ways with church planning two different churches. And people would kind of say that. They would say, "Well, Ma, you've had such a wonderful ministry." But I would always look back and say, in fact, I remember at a staff meeting once, someone said, "You don't seem you don't seem happy." And I said, "Oh, I'm happy. I'm just not satisfied because I see too much of a disconnect between what we're doing and getting praised for and what I see in the New Testament." And I said, they would always come back and say, "But everybody says this is such a great church," or and I'd say, "Well, we're the tallest midget." It's relatively everyone is flunking this course, and we were at least trying to do some things and having occasional success here and there, but we were nothing more than the tallest midget. There were some huge gaps in our discipleship, and so I think that what brought me, to answer your question, Greg, what really intrigued me with the Bonhoeffer Project was that at one point, after I had founded a second church called New Community Church, and served there for 13 years, or just I think it was just into 13 years as senior pastor. I had a very capable guy, with me, who'd been with me for, even at the past church. So I said, I want to make a switch here. I was 63 years old, I think, at the time. I said, I don't want to retire, but I want to step back and get out of trying to run the business of the church. I want to get back to doing what I got in the ministry to do, which was to disciple men. And it just became obvious that it was too challenging. You're being pulled in all these different directions when you're senior pastor. So my associate took over, has done a great job. We're getting ready for another succession now. And I was able to focus just completely on discipleship and trying to crack this problem of why are we not doing a better job at discipleship? Not just us, but the church at large. So I took a sabbatical. I read all kinds of books. I attended a bunch of conferences. I talked to pastors up and down the East Coast. And, it became obvious that I was not the only one that was having this frustration. It was pervasive. Everybody I talked to was frustrated with it. And so at one point, a number of years into it, in fact, I was 69, so it's like 6 years later, I began to think, well, my former boss, Bill Hall, who was my first director with Athletes in Action, and Bill had played with our basketball team. And then he spent a year as a director with the pro sports teams, and then he went to seminary. He became a pastor, author, wrote a couple books on discipleship. And because we'd had that early connection, I read a couple of his books and found them helpful. But I began to think, I wonder if Bill's still alive. And so I Googled him, and sure enough, it pops up the Bonhoeffer Project and another group called discipleship.org. And so the more I read, the more intrigued I got. I showed up at the National Discipleship Forum in Nashville. Was it 3 years ago now, I guess? And I walked up to him and said, "I'm Hollis Haff. Do you remember me?" And in fact, his comment was, "How can I forget you? You and I had breakfast with Terry Bradshaw." So, we reconnected after like 40 years. And as I sat and I listened to the breakout sessions that he led and some others in the organization, I realized that my prayer of all those years was being answered. He was speaking directly to some of the frustrations that I'd had with disciple making. He was giving me compelling answers. He was backing it up with scripture. And so I left that conference kind of convinced that God led me there and that God was going to use that in a pretty significant way.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of those issues, because I think there are real issues, especially in the American church, when it comes to the gospel that we teach. So let's start unpacking those and how they relate to well, maybe we should backtrack a little bit and talk about why it's called the Bonhoeffer Project. That might be confusing to people because it's not the typical name for a ministry, You want to explain that to people?
Yeah, we're not Lutherans and we're not neo-Orthodox, but we are big fans of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bill Hall read The Cost of Discipleship when he was a young Christian. It made such an impact on him that he wanted to honor Bonhoeffer by naming the organization. And many of his Bonhoeffer's emphases, his book on his The Cost of Discipleship was really an attack on cheap grace, this kind of antinomianism, kind of against the law, this reductionism of the gospel message, and we see the same thing in our own American culture today. Bonhoeffer was also committed to training pastors and Christian leaders. He started a seminary called Finkenwald. It was an underground seminary because they had to stay clear of the Gestapo. But I think there was that combination between his message and his methodology, which was he saw a need for a renewal in the way people were being trained for ministry, not just to get a lot of head knowledge, but to be formed and shaped in what he called a new monasticism. And by that, he simply meant that there was the discipleship was all about discipline. And it was about, forming disciplines that would shape our souls. And he understood that. And he brought that to that seminary. And it really did shape the lives of young men.
Yeah. Tom, do you have anything to say about Bonhoeffer? Did you read that book?
Yes, I read that.
Classic book.
And then more recently, his biography. I really enjoyed that. I think there was just great insights into his commitment.
Yeah. So, all right. So you explained why it's called the Bonhoeffer Project. What are some of the issues that they're really addressing? And I know, you do these cohorts for 10 months. A group of men will meet together. Do they meet monthly or weekly?
Monthly. Yeah.
Monthly.
Yeah. Let me back up a little bit, and I can kind of segue with another point of connection with Bonhoeffer that is even more germane to the present situation. One of the things that's attractive about Bonhoeffer, beyond just the message, the clarity of his message, his methodology, was his character. He exercised a certain moral courage in the midst of overwhelming pressure against the Third Reich. I mean, he was born in the lap of luxury. He could have lived a life of comfort and ease, but he chose to leave that and to go back to Germany to pretty much sign a death warrant. And there's a great need in our day for that kind of moral courage. So he also sort of props that up. But let me take your next question, which was, so what's the problem you're trying to address? And you actually referenced it early on. You talked about what we need is not more the ABCs of the gospel, but the A through Z of the gospel, which is a quote from Tim Keller that I love too, and I use all the time, because it frames the problem. The problem is we have reduced the gospel to a couple of simple steps that we could call a plan of salvation. And the gospel is much bigger than that. The gospel, when you just think of the word gospel, oh, well, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the story of Jesus. And the story of Jesus is much richer than just a couple of propositional truths like God loves you, you're separated from God because of your sin, Jesus died to bridge the chasm between you and God, and you need to ask him into your life. Now, that's all true. But when you make part of the truth all the truth, it becomes an untruth. And there's much more to the gospel than that. And that's what Keller was getting at with that line about the A through Z of the gospel. I look back on my own experience. I had seen the graffiti on the walls. I had heard the talks where people would give the ABCs of the gospel. And quite frankly, all it did was leave me with a little bit of guilt. But it wasn't until I began really hearing people teach the Bible and begin to dig into the illustration of the great truths of Scripture and their application, that all of a sudden, those aha moments began coming, fast and furious. And that's when change really took place and the trajectory of my discipleship took off. So the problem, simply stated, is that we have created a separation between conversion and discipleship. We've given people the idea that if you simply say this prayer, sort of agree to this plan of salvation, that Jesus will come into your life and you'll be eternally secure. You go to heaven when you die, your sins will be forgiven. And yet there's so much more that misses, that it makes sense. And one of our key lines is that the gospel you preach will determine the disciples that you make. And if you look at the landscape, the spiritual landscape in America today, or for that matter, around the world, you see it littered with all these kinds of what we would call false gospels, partial gospels. It's not that they're totally false, it's just that they don't say enough. So, we can talk about that, but I'll let you ask a question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate, and I agree. I agree with what you're sharing. I think this is a really important. We need to clarify these things, and so part of what the Bonhoeffer Project does is brings leaders together to really clarify. You spend some good time explaining what is the gospel, and that the gospel does involve discipleship. Yeah, I mean, Tom, have you seen this issue in your ministry?
Oh yeah, I really have. I can think of days just being in a locker room. I mean, it got to be where I would rarely ask a player if he was a Christian. You'd rather get in a conversation with him and begin to talk about following Christ. And you found the guys that not only understood the gospel, but they were following through with it, and they'd become learners and followers. One of the words for disciple is a learner. And so you could see a very distinct difference between the players, the guys that embraced the whole thing and the guys that, well, yeah, I went forward at a church, and you're not always sure what really happened in their lives.
So you get people in cohorts, you get groups of leaders together who want to be disciple makers, and then you go over, I know the gospel is one of the subjects you go over. What are some of the other subjects that you talk about?
Yeah, let me give you the framework for the cohorts. First of all, cohort is 5 to 10 leaders. We meet monthly for 10 months. Sometimes we'll have a retreat on the front end where we'll merge sessions 1 and 2. There is an option to do that on the back end too, so you could kind of, bracket your experience with 2 retreats. But you have flexibility to kind of do whatever your group needs. When you meet for an hour each month, you meet for 3 hours and you discuss. There are 3 books that you go through: the Discipleship Gospel, Conversion, and Discipleship. You can't have one without the other. And those first 2 are by Bill Hall, and the third one by Brandon Cook, How to Live and Love Like Jesus. And the first 2 books are more what we would call upstream sources, and Brandon's book is more downstream. And what I mean by that, and it really kind of goes to your answering your question, if you had a stream, a mountain stream, if you can imagine a mountain stream, and it's gotten polluted, it's got toxic water in it. What a lot of people would do is jump right into the middle of the stream, get a bucket, and begin to try to throw the contaminated water out. The only thing you're going to do is wear yourself out, and you're not going to change anything. So, because the problem's not midstream, the problem is upstream. It's the gospel. In other words, it's what Scripture teaches the gospel is. And if you get that wrong, you're going to have those problems midstream and downstream. So we spend the first couple of, that's exactly what happens in the gospel. Pastors are constantly thinking, well, if I could just get them into a small group, or get them to memorize Scripture, or do any of these, many wonderful things that Christians do to grow, but it's almost like they resist it. And I remember someone once said to me, it's not a discipleship problem, it's a salvation problem we have. In other words, we've fostered a false gospel, and so now people think they've become a Christian simply because they've said a prayer. And so what you have to do is to go back upstream and really understand the gospel in its fullness. And so we spend the first 2 months actually rebuilding the gospel from the book of Mark. We do some fun exercises where you go out and you ask your friends and people in your churches, what do you think the gospel is? And you're flabbergasted by people that you've been teaching for years, and they come up with some really bad answers. So you begin to understand, okay, a problem well defined is half solved. A problem well defined is half solved. And so once you understand the problem, now you can address that. And then once you get that clarity around that, you come down, you start, defining disciple. Another word that Christians throw around, it's part of our vocabulary, but people mean all kinds of different things by what a disciple is or what discipleship is. The average understanding in the American church is that discipleship is getting existing believers together into a Bible study and deepening their scriptural knowledge. Now, we're all for that. Anybody that knows me knows that I'm big on the Bible. But Jesus himself said in Matthew 4:19, he said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." If you think about that sentence, it has three components. It says a disciple is someone who is, one, following Jesus, two, is being changed by Jesus, and three, is on mission for Jesus. And I could go through this at a speed that you're going to miss this. So I would say to your listeners, so listen closely. If Jesus just gave us what it means to be his follower, then we can't say that we're following him if we're not fishing for men, if we're not on mission with Jesus. So another helpful, I think, paradigm shift that the curriculum is able to take on is to help change the end game. The end game is not just to have eternal Bible studies with Christians. It is rather to equip them to be able to reproduce and multiply other Christ followers. Now, that's a whole lot harder. But once you get clarity around your mission, your vision, what you're trying to do, it really does help the other things, which is you come down through now sessions 8, 3 through 10. Well, I guess it'd be 4 through 10. Sorry about that. You're starting to work through the Holy Spirit and his role in transformation, and then you're getting into the spiritual disciplines and the church, the pastorate, and so forth. So the curriculum is designed to go start upstream with dealing with the gospel and what a disciple really is, and then coming downstream and helping people to get into the ways and means of Jesus. Okay, so how did Jesus do that? One of the most interesting exercises we do is to have our participants go through one of the gospels. They pick a gospel, they go through it chapter by chapter, and try to identify insights or lessons on discipleship from each chapter. And we did this in our church, and then we went back and actually did what we call an integrated series. Oh, and the last part I would probably say about the cohort and understanding it is that as you go, and you take what you're learning and you put it into a discipleship plan for your unique ministry setting. So when you get out, it's not just, I went to another conference, there's the binder on the shelf. I've got a plan that I've spent 10 months developing. And in my case, I kept doing it because we went into the year of COVID. And, we were able to implement that plan at our church during COVID, and it was remarkable in how it helped us to keep a disconnected congregation connected by focusing on that theme with kind of laser focus. We would do an integrated study on the Gospel of Mark, where we went through Mark chapter by chapter and talked about, we called it rediscovering discipleship. And we went through the Gospel of Mark 8 months or 8 sessions in the fall, 8 sessions in the spring. So we stretched it out over a year so that you could not avoid it. We taught through it from the pulpit, and then in our small groups, we would have questions to help them process the same message and to talk to each other. And most of this was going on by Zoom. And then at a personal level, so if you think of a triangle with, here's your preaching is at the tip of the pyramid, and then at the 2 bases are small groups and personal devotions. For personal devotions, we went through 2 of those books that we go through in the cohort, and in 5 to 10 minute little devotionals every day. So if you were plugging in and engaging, you really got a good, you really got educated in discipleship over that time. Although what you realize is you never arrive at discipleship. You never graduate. It's lifelong. And, but at least, we got everybody's attention. We laid a great foundation. And so then as part of my plan, someone gave me some very wise advice. They said, be sure you've got something to do after you finish your integrated series. So after we did the series, about 2 months later, I had Bill Hall come in. It was actually the first, I think, speaking engagement he took on. We were always wondering, will we actually be able to do it live and in person? And we had a couple hundred people there live, which was one of the first things that we did coming out of COVID. And I think we had 400 that were watching on live stream. So it was just a huge success. And a lot of other discipleship things today. Our men's ministry is going through, one of the concepts called the 4 chairs of disciplemaking. It's kind of spreading into all the little nooks and crannies of the church. We're training our leadership community in some of these concepts. So we're trying to create a culture of discipleship. And, they trained me well to not expect that this is going to happen in a few months or even a year or 2. It's probably a good 3 to 5 year initiative to begin to even make some inroads, and we're seeing inroads, but we still have a long way to go. But we're very excited about it because we feel like I've never seen anything that resonates as deeply with people who are concerned about these issues. They immediately begin to pick up on it and go, that's what I've been missing.
One of the things I hear you saying, Hollis, that is so crucial, this really is an extreme culture shift within the church. Yeah. The evangelical church is so into teaching, which is good stuff, so into education, if you will. We're an educated church as opposed to a discipling church. Yeah. And what I see so much happen when that shift is made, the reason people get excited is because they're not just learning things, but as they apply it and move it to other people's lives, they don't become bored. They're challenged. They begin to stretch their faith. They're praying differently. They're beginning to say, what is going on in this guy's life that I need to walk with him through? I've even heard many pastors say in recent years that Bible studies are the greatest detriment to discipleship.
Yeah.
Because they become dead-ended. There's no purpose other than learning some more facts.
Yeah, and it's not the Great Commission either. It doesn't say go make disciples, teaching them. There's no period there. It says teach them to obey.
Yes.
So Dallas Willard used to say that's the great omission of the Great Commission. We've been satisfied just to teach people endless Bible studies when Jesus is committed to teaching people to obey. And one of the ways we do that practically in the Bonhoeffer Project is, and this phrase has gone viral now. It's all over. Is that we're not into information-based discipleship. We're into obedience-based discipleship. So, for instance, in your small groups, or let's say Mom asks Johnny after Sunday school, "Hey, what did you learn today in Sunday school?" Well, the very question, betrays the bias that it's what did you learn, not what did you obey, what are you going to apply. So in our small groups, we always ask the question, what did you do this last week to apply Jesus's teaching or the teaching of the New Testament? What are you going to do this next week to apply or obey what Scripture asks? And it's amazing how that simple question can just kind of flip the small group. And it shifts it into a different paradigm that's obedience focused now rather than knowledge focused. Although you still learned a lot.
Right. I love this, and I got all kinds of questions swirling about in my head. One of the things I want to just share and get your thoughts on, both you guys, is one of the issues I see is that we teach that people come to know Jesus by grace through faith. It's a free gift. But then when it comes to growing in the Christian life, it's all through hard work and effort. It's like works-based. We don't believe in works-based salvation, but we believe in works-based sanctification. And that's where I think that we miss it, that the gospel not only brings us to Christ for our salvation, but the gospel's key for our spiritual growth. So you talked about the spiritual disciplines. And to me, the shift is if you get it wrong, if you go with works-based sanctification, the spiritual disciplines are things that you have to do. You have to do this. You have to go to church. You have to read your Bible. You have to pray. The way I look at it, though, is, but if you get it right, if you understand that, it's not something you have to do, it's something you get to do.
Exactly.
You get to do it because you're following Jesus. And if you follow Jesus, you want to know him more. So you want to go to church. You want to do Bible study, you want to do those things. It just seems to me like so many people in our churches, even if the preaching is preaching the gospel, people are just trying to work out their salvation through hard work and effort. I mean, Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's Hollis, you might know, but I think it's Dallas Willard that had made the statement that grace is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning.
Yeah.
And that really clarifies a lot. Both my wife and I have some Bible studies where some of the people have really struggled with that any effort is legalism. Any effort takes me out of the realm of faith. And yet I think of guys like Jerry Bridges, who writes about this, and he says, hey, if you're a farmer, you got to get out and plant and cultivate and weed before you're going to have a harvest. But God is the one that brings the sunshine, causes it to germinate. He said you can't get away from effort and growth, but it's not earning. So it really is a mindset on how I view grace.
Yeah, Dallas Willard also said the church is not only saved by grace, it's been paralyzed by grace. and it's really it's kind of a reductionistic understanding of grace. Again, what we do in one of the sessions in the Bonhoeffer Project is we go through the vocabulary of salvation, all the key words, and you kind of see it. This tendency to reduce a complex reality to something more simplistic. For instance, grace gets reduced to the forensic aspect of it, which is you've been declared not guilty. And that's, I mean, I went back. I mean, when you said when you asked what mistakes did you make? After I attended this first Bonhoeffer session, I went back and looked at a course that I taught called Starting Out in the Christian Life. And I used all my favorite illustrations on justification and, coming to Christ and so forth. And what shocked me was they all focused on the forensic aspect of the legal declaration. Now, grace in the New Testament is not just forgiveness, it's also empowerment. When Paul says, for the grace of God teaches us to say no to ungodliness and to pursue, we've got, lists of just all the action words that show that, no, this is exactly what was expected to flow out of a genuine conversion. And oftentimes what will happen is that, kind of a prayer or a signing of a card or something gets substitute, and in a person's mind, they think they've made that decision. So anyway, enough on the grace thing. But when you teach grace from the New Testament, it's much bigger than the way it's popularly been presented. If you miss the empowerment aspect, see, that's part of the good news. You're going, oh my gosh, yes, and I can't live this kind of a life, but Christ can do it through me if I learn how to surrender my life to him and let him live his life through me. So when Paul says, I no longer live, it's Christ who lives in me, and the life that I now live, I live by the faith of the Son of God. So great. All these terms are much bigger than we often teach them. And that's where we get into a lot of our problems.
And I love 2 Peter 3:18, I believe, where Peter says, grow in grace.
Yes.
And, he's saying that to believers, grow in grace. So we don't move beyond grace into, works. And I appreciate what you said too, Tom, that it does take effort, but there's something about the default setting of our heart is so much bent towards self-justification that we can come to Christ by grace, but then we have to we have to prove ourselves, and I think that's a big challenge. And I think your Bonhoeffer Project addresses that. Okay. So in the last few minutes we have together, tell me some stories about like men who've gone through this and how you've seen their lives change, and maybe your own personal story of you've been sharing some personal examples, but what do you see the transformation, and what gets you excited about like the future and seeing this? It seems like the ministry, as I was reading about it online, is growing because it's growing through multiplication, which is the way, 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul to Timothy, Timothy to reliable men, and then to others.
Yeah, I think that, what's exciting to me, Greg, is that, I just came back from a national discipleship forum, 17 organizations from across, navigators represented there, some of the old traditional discipleship organizations, some of the new ones like Bonhoeffer and others. But you get the sense that you are on the cusp of something that God is doing. That great line by Blackaby, don't just go looking for something to do, look for what God's already doing and then get in the midst of it. You go to a conference like this, you come back thinking God's stirring something up here. And, and I've seen it in my own experience when I went to that first Bonhoeffer breakout series, and it turned upside down the way I was sharing the gospel. And I was, I was looked at as a spiritual guru in our community, a good Bible teacher. And yet I had to say, I've been complicit in this problem. I I've been teaching kind of a partial gospel, what we call the forgiveness only gospel. But to give you an example of how does this change? Well, first of all, I don't even ask people anymore, are they Christians? I say, are you a Christ follower? It's always interesting. You get a pause when you say that. I started changing the way I presented the gospel. I would talk more about the kingdom of God, and this gets into more of the details of the cohort. But I began to realize that when Jesus first came on the scene, he didn't talk about dying for people's sins. He talked about the gospel of God is at hand, and he went throughout all Judea, teaching the kingdom is at hand. Repent, believe the gospel, and follow me. So I started saying to people, don't pray prayers, follow Jesus. Now that sounds a little much, and I always qualify it, but I remember the first time I heard Bill Hull say this, and it just stuck with me because I'd grown up in a Christian culture in which we were always getting people to pray prayers. But, as we would say, funny Steelers story, after we were coming back from one of those high school assemblies, Tunchi Oken, the former broadcaster and an all pro for the Steelers, we said how many made checks on their cards, meaning how many made quote decisions, and he said we had 571 decisions, but there were 3 that were saved. And everybody immediately just fell off their chairs in laughter because we all knew that check mark did not indicate a true conversion. But I wasn't able to kind of frame it, articulate it until I went through my Bonhoeffer experience. And so now, and this is what Bill Hull said. He said, if you look at Luke 9, he said, Jesus turns to the crowds. And he said, notice he did not turn to the disciples. He turned to the crowds. And he said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to lose his life must give it away. So, he stopped and he made this very poignant point. Jesus was not talking to his disciples here. He was talking to the crowds. But how often have you ever heard an evangelistic message like, take up your cross and follow me? And I thought, that's really true. We always sort of say, well, they're not ready for that yet. We've got to kind of hold that off. And that's what, of course, has created this tension between decisions and discipleship. So, I think I find myself just saying to people, hey, in fact, this is Bill Hull line too. Follow Jesus and he'll teach you everything you need to know. Everybody always wants to know, I need to know more before I go out and witness or whatever. And, Bill would say to them, and I think Jesus would say to him, just follow me. I'll teach you what you need to know. And I think if you talk to Tom and I, in our common background with Athletes in Action and Campus Crusade, that's what happened to us. They didn't wait until we were theologically educated. They just nudged us out into ministry, into sharing our faith. And that's what got us, moving forward. Because we were following Jesus, even though we were scared half out of our minds.
So here's my last question, and this is for both you guys. What advice would you give a pastor of a church? Because you guys understand the stress that a pastor is under, who really wants to make disciples, but he finds himself just doing church. What's one thing or what's a couple things he could do differently to begin to make disciples in his church? Because I think I think we have to have tremendous compassion towards these pastors. I think a lot of them have never experienced disciple making. If they've never been discipled, then they don't know how to make other disciples.
Yeah. And
but do you have any words of advice you would give to a pastor who is just just trying to do church every week?
Yeah, Tom, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, one of the things that I've found recently is a conversation with a pastor to ask him to kind of share, dream out loud of what kind of an impact is it that you want to have in your church and your people's lives. I met with a businessman today who couldn't talk enough about his pastor, who had become his best friend, who mentored him, who this guy, without being asked to do it, is asking, okay, now how do I find a guy to disciple? How do I lead my sons to Christ? And so he's been so impacted by the friendship of this pastor who has in the back of his mind, it's influencing a few people who will influence others. And I think a lot of pastors, in fact, I've heard a consultant to major churches say over breakfast about 10 years ago, he said to me, there's a movement on mega church pastors that they're backing up from the pulpit saying, I've had a full church for a lot of years, but I've not left an impact. And they're backing up and looking for young men to mentor and disciple in ministry and an impact. And I think they realize I've been real busy, but I've not left a legacy of men and women who will have an impact when I'm gone. So for me, that's one of the things that has a pastor begin to unhook from the things he loves to do in ministry that are comfortable to him. And he begins to wrestle with what is the impact I want to leave?
Greg, I think you're asking a very perceptive question. I've thought about it a lot. I think in America, in our culture today, it is very difficult. There is an enormous pressure on pastors, and quite frankly, by taking the road less traveled and not trying to stir things up, they can do pretty well. They can live pretty comfortably. And so what would I say to them? I think first I would identify with the tensions. I felt them myself. I would talk about my own complicity in the problem over the years. And I would probably encourage them to read the book by Metaxas that Tom referenced earlier on Bonhoeffer, because he showed the kind of moral courage that pastors need today to take with their congregations and in their communities. If we're going to be able to actually ignite this new reformation, this resurgence or renaissance of discipleship, it's going to take moral courage, more than just people going through cohorts, more than just people reading the books. They're going to have to have a come to Jesus moment and find the moral courage that he can give them.
Mm.
But once they do, I think they'll be glad they did.
That's excellent. All right, guys. Well, if people want to learn more about your ministries, Tom, share once again your website, and maybe just share briefly what's on your website, what kind of resources people can find. And
my website is catapultministries.org. We basically use it as a site where we can make available materials and perspectives, or resources and perspectives. So there are two main areas there. We talk about influence, just like we work with athletes to expand their influence because of their platform with Christ. We're doing the same thing now with businessmen, having them begin to look at what platform has God given them, what has he prepared them for, and help them begin to think outside themselves and rather what God's called them to do. And then the other side is working with disciplers. What kind of materials are available to help with discipleship or mentoring of guys that are going to become disciplers?
excellent. And Hollis, thank you so much for your time tonight. Really appreciate what you shared. So what can people do as a next step if they want to learn about the Bonhoeffer Project? And
yeah, well, thanks, Greg. It's been a pleasure to be on your podcast. You can go to the bonhoefferproject.com, and you will see all kinds of resources, books, and so forth that are available. You'll see the cohorts there, the cohorts that are coming up. that you could possibly jump into. Bear in mind that even if there's not a full group in your area, we have what are called hybrid groups, where you have some people meeting in person and others meeting on Zoom. And you get the history of the Bonhoeffer Project and probably anything else like that you need to know.
Okay, great. Hey, bonus question for you, Hollis. Knowing what you know now, and I can tell how excited you are and how much you've like grown and kind of like focused in on like what was missing for so many years, how would it change the devotions you would lead in a chaplaincy? Like, because I'm guessing, I would love to see both your guys's. I would love to see a typical devotion you led with these athletes, and I'm guessing that the devotion you would write today would be a lot different than the one you gave to Terry Bradshaw those years ago. And what would it be more of a call to discipleship, or what would it be different? Maybe it wouldn't. I don't know.
That's an interesting question. I talked a lot about discipleship even during those days. The problem was the lack of clarity around the gospel. I think was becoming an obstacle. But I give a talk now where I kind of go very quickly, highlight the Great Commission and some key teaching points, and then I go through my kind of biographical. Here's the early years in which I was just, I got to be the chaplain with the Steelers and do all these exciting things, and it was kind of a romance. And then the middle years when I became a church planner, and I began to see the culture shift from, from win, build, send to sit, soak, sour, and then the senior years, which started when I really stepped down from being senior pastor and began to focus, on this discipleship problem and the things that I learned and how that has shaped me. And that's what I would share. The Steelers, because of their success, get alumni gatherings every now and then, and I'm hoping at some point. I was just thinking about this, and I mean, it might be many years apart. So I'd love to go back and have a chapel and say, I want to take you through the early years, the middle years, and the senior years, because most of these guys now, and I still am in touch with a lot of them. So we're talking about this stuff all the time, but there's a bunch of them that I haven't had a chance to see.
It's always interesting, isn't it, to, when you stay in ministry, and we've all been, I've been in ministry 30 plus years. You look back and you wish you had your wisdom now in those early days.
Yeah.
But it's great. Tom, you have any final thoughts you want to share? Anything you want to share?
No, I think it's what Hollis has said. Discipleship is a lifelong process. It's a thing we learn for a lifetime. I've said to a couple of people recently, the hard part about being older is you realize what you missed along the way. Yeah. But the exciting part, it's making more sense now. And so there's a low point, a high point to it, and let's just keep going for it.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.